Good morning and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, 21 March 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike again today. Let's get started off with Inside the Beltway. The Trump administration, according to people briefed on the plans, is planning to announce a first round of federal judge nominations in the coming weeks. And according to these people, Trump officials are laying the groundwork to quickly move these judges through the confirmation process. And the last time I looked, there were about 45 openings in the federal judiciary that Trump can fill in the trial courts. Pamela Bondi, the attorney general, also announced charges against 3 individuals arrested in Oregon, Colorado, and South Carolina, and they're accused of conducting some of these arson attacks on Tesla vehicles, charging stations, and dealerships that we've been talking about over the last week. And according to Bondi's announcement, these 3 defendants used Molotov cocktails, and one targeting a dealership in Oregon was arrested with a suppressed AR-15 rifle. Now, Mike and I have talked a lot about with Stop Cop City, and last year ahead of the election, the arson attacks on some of these ballot drop boxes in the Northwest, and the organized far left and anarchist groups that have engaged in these type of arson attacks. Their typical tactic, technique, and procedures to use an incendiary device, place it on the front tire of a vehicle, light it, and it gives them time to escape before the vehicle is completely destroyed. And so looking at this announcement, these individuals use Molotov cocktails, which I've seen in the last week a lot on some of these anarchist blogs that we pay attention to, organized left-wing groups warning against using Molotov cocktails and telling their fellow travelers that they need to use these incendiary devices. I think this points to, in some of these cases, and especially these 3, these being self-radicalized lone wolf actors and not organized left-wing groups. Some of the other incidents that have been reported on do look to be more likely to be organized left-wing anarchist or Antifa groups. And then moving on to Trump invoking the Defense Production Act for critical minerals. And this was an executive order that was issued yesterday. And it's directing the International Development Finance Corporation and the Department of Defense to finance new critical mineral projects. And in this order, Trump is also encouraging faster permitting for these mining and processing projects across the United States, and is also directing the Interior Department to prioritize critical mineral production on federal lands. And I'd like to bring Jared on to talk about this item because, when I read through this order, it also said that the U.S. is reliant on imports of 15 critical minerals, and 70% of those imports come from China. This is something we've talked a lot about. And I think we were talking before the show about this, and I think the main consequence for the United States is that the Trump administration is attempting this pivot to China containment. And we've already seen during the Biden administration, China started cutting off exports of key minerals that are important for U.S. defense production. I think they're likely to respond with additional export controls on other critical minerals. And this would disrupt supply chains for these critical inputs into U.S. industry and defense supply chains. But I think you made an important point about how this is a double-edged sword for China.
Yes, China largely is a refiner of minerals, so they will take the ore and then put out the refined metals, not necessarily the finished product. Though they do put out plenty of finished product as well. The double-edged sword here is that because they are generally importing ores for refining, they also are very susceptible to blockades. We've been talking about the Godar port. They're trying to get that secondary route opened up, but right now, basically everything runs through the Malacca Strait, and that's very susceptible to just being blockaded and shutting down trade to China. Which it was probably a month ago we covered the preparations for a multinational blockade through the primary, secondary, and tertiary routes to China over in the Oceania archipelago, which is largely Indonesia. So if China were to really push the world, quite frankly, into, well, we're going to cut you guys off because we're tired of being contained, it is very easy to escalate that into, well, you will still be contained, and now there's no shipping anywhere.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to the roll-ups for this morning. And first, there were reports earlier this week coming out of the French government, French officials claiming that a researcher was denied entry in the United States over some political comments that were found on his phone by Customs and Border Patrol. And now DHS is saying, well, actually, this French researcher was denied entry into the U.S. after confidential information stolen from Los Alamos National Laboratory was found on his phone. And I think it's likely that DHS is correct or is telling the truth here, because the French, as a policy, they engage heavily in industrial and economic espionage. So this looks to be a situation where a French spy or someone who was contracted by French intelligence to steal confidential information, U.S. industrial information, was caught trying to re-enter the United States. Moving on to the domestic income, the New York Court of Appeals, which is the New York State equivalent of a Supreme Court, they struck down a New York City law that allowed non-citizens to vote in local elections, and they said that they said the New York State Constitution limits voting to citizens only. And I think there's a possibility, depending on the language present in other states that have tried this, that we could see court cases where local elections that allow non-citizens to vote will also be blocked by those states equivalent of the Supreme Court. And then finally, the domestic income, green banks in California, Minnesota, and Illinois, they said the Trump administration violated the Administrative Procedures Act by terminating greenhouse gas reduction fund contracts. And this is over $20 billion that the Biden administration deposited at Citibank ahead of President Trump's inauguration. And I think this points toward what we said when that happened, is that the Biden administration was attempting to put that money out of the reach of the Trump administration before the turnover. Moving, if Jerry could come on, we're going to move on to our global roll-ups.
Yes, Taiwan's executive cabinet appointed Japanese General Shigeru Iwasaki to a government advisor position. This is in Taiwan, advising basically their presidential cabinet. Now, Iwasaki formerly served as Japan's highest military position, the Chief of Staff of the Joint Staff, which is roughly equivalent to our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he's going to advise them on policy decisions for the next year. China has already lodged a complaint with Japan, but I don't expect to see a military response for this. However, this does show Japan's continued commitment toward maintaining the status quo over Taiwan. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is hosting all of his provincial premiers today in Ottawa to discuss a unified response to Chinese and American tariffs. Now, Carney's trying to also formulate a plan here because Canada has technically 13 separate economies, not a single economy, which has really been highlighted in their election season here, that they don't even have free trade. They have to between their provinces and territories. So that once they figure that out, that will be the stepping stone toward actually formulating a coherent response. And if they fail to do so, frankly, the trade war is not likely to last very long. Europe is seeking greater responsibility over in NATO, which this was seen quite a bit last night when it was announced. There are officials from the UK, Germany, France, and several of the Nordic nations that are reportedly drawing up a plan to take on greater defense responsibilities in the NATO architecture. And they intend to propose this to President Trump prior to the June NATO summit. Now, all of this they do expect to take 5 to 10 years to implement, because they're frankly not ready to just take on their responsibilities right now. They will have to bolster their forces, both in personnel and materiel, as well as their defense industrial base.
Well, this is something that, I think you mentioned it, it's Elbridge Colby says basically this in his book, and he's of course still nominated for, I think, Assistant Defense Secretary for Policy Planning. But the idea is that we have this pivot to China and Europe needs to stand on its own. And this to me looks like a sign of that. But have you seen anything else where these EU countries are taking concrete steps to do, actually stand on their own defense-wise?
Some of them are a bit more concrete. We covered the anti-personnel mine treaty yesterday that Poland and the Baltic states are leaving. The Netherlands, they just announced last night, maybe this morning, that they intend to more than double their total personnel in the army from 74,000 up to 200,000. We've seen we covered France extending their umbrella in actual material conditions. So they'll be rolling that out. All of those point toward greater European autonomy in the NATO architecture. I think we are going to see a much stronger Europe in the next few years. There are other issues that they need to also address, like the migration crisis, but those we'll just have to keep an eye on.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and hit our last item.
And then moving down to South America, the Bolivian president, Luis Arce, said that there are not enough dollars in Bolivia. Just straight up, not enough of them. Now, Arce claims that this is causing a lack of natural gas exploration in Bolivia and a lack of natural gas production, as well as rising food prices attended to, higher cost of energy. And the president blames the previous presidency for the lack of dollar shortage. I suspect this is going to end up with a request for foreign direct investment into Bolivia, just because they will need this for their reserve currencies.
Thank you, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And first, we're going to talk about the acting Drug Enforcement Administration administrator. He did an interview with local media in Colorado last night. His name's Derek Maltz. And he said Colorado is ground zero for the most violent criminal organizations in the U.S. And he said this includes Tren de Aragua. And this is due to vulnerabilities in Colorado state policies. He also said that the command and control for Tren de Aragua in the entire U.S. is centralized in Colorado. I think in this, I will watch this interview, and I think Maltz is referring to Colorado state and local sanctuary policies on immigration. Colorado passed in, I think it was 2019 during the first Trump administration, they passed a state-level law effectively blocking cooperation with ICE, and also cannabis legalization, which are much earlier in the decade, blocked state and local authorities from cooperating with federal law enforcement. And this is something, it seems like a trend in the West and the Northeast, where we're seeing a lot of these legalization and decriminalization initiatives, where transnational criminal organizations are using these policies as cover to take over legal cannabis operations throughout the West and Northeast. And in the Northeast, interestingly, there is a heavy Chinese organized crime presence with ties to the Chinese Communist Party that has significantly grown in both the illegal and legal narcotics trade over the last decade. And they are intertwined with Latin American cartels and transnational criminal organizations. And I think we talked about this probably in 2023. They have also taken over money laundering for just about every cartel that has operations in Latin America and the United States. Jared, if you can come on, we'll move on to your warning item for today, talking about U.S. sanctions against China meant to hurt Iran.
Yep. The State Department announced new sanctions just yesterday. Now, these are against a couple of Chinese oil refineries and then, quote, 12 entities and one individual. Now, this is because China's the largest importer of Iranian oil, and the State Department promised that this would continue as long as Iran still funds, quote, destabilizing activities, which includes backing the Houthis. Now, this has a triple effect that's pretty on the surface here. This will start hurting Chinese oil production or oil refinery. This is going to hurt Iran's funding, which in turn makes Iran a little bit less stable, makes it a little bit harder for them to produce weapons and to fund their proxies. And this starts to address a core issue of the Red Sea shipping crisis, because if you can cut off funding at the source, then suddenly your fighting force there in the Red Sea is significantly less able to actually pin down the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Now, I would like to focus a little bit on the Chinese oil production, because this is very important for cutting off, for raising the price of everything in China. Obviously, that will affect gas, but it will also affect their shipping industry. You need fuel for all of your ships. China is an importer for fuel, and what this is going to do is actually, I think it will end up slowing down ship production a little bit, just because it will be more expensive on every single you have to move fuel, it's going to cost more. It will cost more just to produce the fuel, and ship fuel is not cheap to begin with. This has the potential to really hinder the Chinese military industrial complex here. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this, and keeping in mind that they also did this against a couple of private refineries here, not just state refineries. So Mike's brought up more than a few times. He had a buddy asking, well, where does China even put all of this oil? And we may end up finding out just through, okay, well, where are these ships going? And we're going to sanction the entity that took on the ship. So I think we're going to end up finding out where all of the oil is being stored, where they're refining it, and really undercut their entire oil refinery industry here.
Yeah, this is, if I remember correctly, this relationship between Iran and China, especially on oil, has been going on for probably a decade and a half or 2 decades. And this was a major part of bringing them together. And you've talked about, this idea that the Trump administration wants to break apart the no limits friendship between China and Russia. And Russia, China, and Iran have been really major parts of what seemed to be a forming like anti-West bloc. Do you think this is a move to try to break up that anti-West bloc, and how successful do you think it'll be?
Maybe. On its face, I don't think so, because this is looking at the relationship between China and Iran, and frankly, I don't see how that's going to happen unless we start really cooperating with Iran, which has there was a little bit of that in the first Trump administration, but that's not normally what we see. I do suspect that China and Iran will try to find an overland route. That way it's easier to obscure and harder to block all of these oil shipments, which we've been discussing that for most of the time I've been on Forward Observer and Early Warning Net right now, is that China's safest play is to try to develop an overland route through Central Asia, which is why we touch on Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and such. That is very fraught for disruption, just naturally, though, due to the instability of that entire region. So it could, but I don't see them diplomatically switching.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers. And I see one from Jonathan Snodgrass. Is it possible for the radical left to do an act of terrorism so egregious that public opinion turns against them? Yeah, it's possible. But I think in this case, the point is, if the idea or the strategy behind targeting Tesla owners in charging stations and dealerships is to scare people who own Teslas into basically selling them and selling off their stock, this is a pretty typical strategy targeting potential support base for your enemy. This is something that the Viet Cong did in Vietnam. This is a common strategy used by revolutionary groups. I don't think that they are going to do some kind of spectacular terrorist attack, just because what they view, this is from what I see, some of these people talking, they view these Tesla arson attacks and vandalisms as being successful so far in trying to really drive a wedge in the MAGA coalition and target Trump or Elon Musk personally. So it's possible. I haven't seen any indicator that there's any kind of plan for some kind of spectacular terrorist attack that would drive public opinion against them specifically. And then the next question from Bad Wabbit regarding the Baltics. I read that they are pushing for Ukraine admittance to the EU. Do you see that happening anytime soon? I'll let Jared answer this one.
I don't think so. If I remember right, the holdup on the Ukraine heading into the EU was corruption charges, which have not been assuaged in the last couple of years. So probably not. We will have to see. They could. It is the EU. We could see them just waive those to strike or to spite Russia. But on its face, for just the process, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
All right. We have a question from Ben T. The Cold War of the 80s and 90s was really a duel of economies, U.S. versus Russia. Russia's military collapsed under the financial strain. EU to suffer a similar fate in building their war machine. Well, my initial thought is this kind of change to building up European defense is going to require them to roll back some of the welfare state that has been reliant on the U.S. subsidizing their defense effectively over the last few decades. So while it might not bankrupt them, I think this will cause some domestic strife because a lot of people are used to the effective welfare states of these EU countries. There is, though, speaking of this parallel with the Cold War, a big part of undermining Russia's economy was really hitting their oil exports by driving down the price of oil. And there is an energy vulnerability that the EU has, that they're reliant on Russian natural gas, and that was, so famously, President Trump was laughed at by EU leaders during his first term when he said this, and then when Russia formally invaded Ukraine in 2022, it became much more real for them. So there is an energy vulnerability, but I think that part of that is going to be mitigated by this Alaska energy hub. Because you made this point, Jared, when we were talking about this off the show, that this pivot to, or the growing importance of a Northwest Passage, that also makes it easier to ship liquid natural gas to Europe.
Yes. The fact that the ice is melting and opening up the Northwest Passage, I think it takes a couple of days off, but it also allows for transit basically directly from the source over to the end customer. So you start cutting out middlemen and you start really making natural gas a lot cheaper. Plus, you get the geostrategic benefit of not being reliant on the people that you're preparing to fight with. So even if it does cost a little bit more, which I don't think it will, it makes more sense for the EU to develop its relationship with Alaska that way. And in addition to that, it is in America's interest to have a strong European continent, even if it may not necessarily be the EU. So I think we could see a strong defense relationship there, similar to what we saw in the Cold War, that would help take a bit of the edge off of a bit of the strain off of the European economies.
All right. And the next, Binti, it was a comment, I think, in response to the Bondi item. That's Binti says, that's great, but would like to see charges filed against the leadership and funding sources. Well, I think the problem with that is the groups like Democracy Forward and Indivisible, they are involved in the protest side of this. And I'm sure on the ground, some of that money probably does make its way to some of these direct actions. This is what we saw with Stop Cop City, with like these bail funds, where money that made its way through the U.S. nonprofit system with these subawardees and the donor managed funds ended up on the street with some of the Stop Cop City people. However, I think that so far the people that they have caught are not connected necessarily to an organized effort. I think these are, in a way, much more dangerous. If we're seeing more lone wolf style arson attacks, these are people getting politically activated by, I think, media, what appears to be media support for these attacks on Tesla or targeting Tesla. And this public sentiment and media sentiment that is sympathetic towards people like Luigi Mangione, and I think this is getting certain people who are vulnerable to being radicalized, like they were already in that state, pushing them into action, taking action. Now, that looking at some of these other incidents, there is of course some what appears to be organized attacks. There's in Oregon, speaking of one of the defendants, there was a case where a dealership was shot up, and some of these arson attacks that appeared to use these incendiary devices that are common with the left anarchist groups that have conducted direct actions in the past. But I don't expect to see charges filed, because I think it's going to be, and the people that have been arrested so far, it'll probably be difficult for them to make a connection between groups like Democracy Forward and Indivisible and any other kind of leadership that's organizing these protests.
Yeah, that's actually a great lead in right to this question. Somewhat of the answer.
Well, yeah. So why is Bonnie not going after the sources of the blogs that Mike follows? Well, part of that is that they're anonymous, and there is an industry within the far left of covering up it's like anti-forensics. Basically, there are groups that focus on cyber forensics and covering their tracks online and offline, and they put out guides and software to do this kind of thing. And so they're probably under multiple layers of VPN and all kinds of anti-forensic tactics that make it difficult to determine exactly who the person is behind Anarchist Federation news posts. And then in some of these blogs, they also allow effectively anonymous postings. And so it is difficult for them to go after these people. And there's also the First Amendment implications here that technically these blogs, these are just speech, and they'd probably have a lot of difficulty if they could find the people saying these things and putting out these guides and strategies, that they would probably have an issue prosecuting them because of First Amendment protections. All right. Well, if we have no further questions,
yeah, I think that is it.
That will do it for us today. We'll be back with you Monday at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.